Claire Vaughn stepped out of her Aston Martin DB12 onto a quiet, sun-bleached suburban street and immediately frowned. The sign in front of her was faded, the letters barely readable against the peeling paint beneath. Mercer Garage. She had expected, at minimum, a polished storefront, a digital display, the clean, antiseptic gleam of a certified service center. Instead, she got a two-bay structure that looked older than most of the trees on the block, a rusted tin roof, a single oscillating fan propped against a side wall, and the distant sound of a classic rock radio station bleeding through a cracked window. Inside, half buried under the hood of a 1972 Jaguar E-Type, a man in a gray work shirt was doing something that didn't involve any diagnostic screen or computer terminal. He was simply listening. His daughter, a girl no older than 9, sat cross-legged on an overturned milk crate beside him, handing him tools the way surgeons hand instruments to their colleagues, silently, instinctively, and always exactly the right one. Claire stood at the entrance for a full 5 seconds before the man acknowledged her, and when he finally did, he didn't look up. He just said, quietly and without ceremony, "Be right with you," Claire almost laughed. "This tiny garage fixes Aston Martins?" Dean Mercer was a name that meant absolutely nothing to Claire Vaughn that morning, and the address had only come up because the navigation system on her DB12 had flagged Mercer Garage as a verified specialist after 3 other facilities, including the brand-certified dealership, had failed to identify why her engine had been running with a subtle but persistent irregularity for the past 6 weeks. The dealership had told her everything was within normal parameters. 2 independent shops had agreed. A 4th technician had replaced the fuel injectors as a precaution and charged her nearly $4,000 for the privilege, after which the irregularity remained exactly as it had been. The GPS had simply done what GPS systems do. It found the next closest option with the right credentials. What the GPS had not prepared her for was the reality of the place itself, or the man who occupied it. The neighborhood where Mercer Garage sat had been a light industrial corridor once, back when the suburb was younger and less self-conscious about property values. Now it was a transitional stretch of residential blocks mixed with small commercial holdovers, a tire shop, a dry cleaner, a Vietnamese bakery that had been there since before anyone could remember, its awning bleached to a color that existed somewhere between orange and tan. The garage occupied a corner lot that its neighbors had clearly hoped for years would become something else, something with better curb appeal and a quieter client base. Brooke Calloway, who lived directly across the street and served on the Neighborhood Homeowners Association board, had submitted 3 formal complaints in the past 2 years alone. The complaints were always variations on the same theme. The foot traffic was inconsistent. The vehicles that arrived were sometimes loud, and the general aesthetic of the property, in her precise and repeated phrasing, ruins the property values of every home within eyeline. Dean had received each complaint, read it carefully, and filed it in a manila folder in the bottom drawer of his desk, where they joined a small but growing archive of municipal correspondence he had no intention of acting on. He had, on one occasion, written a polite and brief response that acknowledged receipt of the concern and assured the sender that all operations were in compliance with local zoning ordinances. He had never heard back. What Brooke's complaints failed to mention, partly because she didn't know, and partly because she had never found it relevant to look, was that Mercer Garage held a quiet and specific reputation in a world she had no access to. That world was not a loud one. It did not advertise. It did not maintain a website beyond a plain single-page listing with a phone number and an address. It did not have any form of public presence. What it had was a phone that rang, reliably and steadily, from people who had gotten the number through channels, that operated almost entirely on trust and whispered recommendation. People who owned cars that most people would never sit in and who had learned, through experience or through a friend's firm insistence, that there was a man on the edge of a forgettable suburb who understood those cars the way almost nobody else did. The people who called were not casual. They were the kind of collectors who flew to other countries to inspect vehicles before purchasing, who maintained climate-controlled storage facilities, who used words like provenance and matching numbers in conversation with the fluency of a specialized vocabulary that had become second nature. These were not people who trusted easily. When they trusted Dean Mercer, they trusted him the way you trust a surgeon who has operated on someone you love. Completely, and for reasons that have nothing to do with the appearance of the building where they work. Tyler Knox arrived 20 minutes after Claire, and he arrived the way he always arrived everywhere, in a black SUV with tinted windows and the particular energy of a man who has concluded that being seen matters more than being right. Tyler ran Knox Automotive Group, which had 3 locations in the metro area, a full staff of certified technicians, and a very attractive partnership agreement with 3 luxury brands, whose names he dropped into conversation the way other people dropped punctuation. He and Claire moved in similar circles, the kind of fundraiser galas and chamber of commerce dinners where everyone's business card had a title that began with chief, and he had heard, through some relay of mutual acquaintances, that Claire had been pointed toward Mercer Garage after the dealership had failed her. He had come, ostensibly, to check on her. In practice, he had come because the idea of a certified Aston Martin owner choosing a one-man suburban garage over his facilities represented a category of professional insult he found privately intolerable. He looked at the building for a long moment, taking in the peeling paint and the rusted trim and the handwritten service hours posted in the window, then looked at Dean, then back at the building. No real Aston owner would trust this place, he said, not quietly, in the direction of no one in particular. From her milk crate near the workbench, Sadie Mercer looked up at him with the calm, assessing gaze of a child who has developed, through long practice, an ability to distinguish between things that are worth responding to and things that are not. She said nothing. She just watched. Dean, for his part, behaved as though Tyler had not spoken. He had already moved to Claire's DB12, opened the hood, and was doing the thing that would, in the coming days, become something people referenced in a very particular tone of voice. He was listening, not scanning, not plugging in a diagnostic reader, not referencing a service manual. He stood at the open hood with his head slightly angled and his eyes somewhere in the middle distance, and he listened to the engine idle for approximately 45 seconds. Then he placed 2 fingers very lightly on the intake manifold housing and held them there for a moment, the way a doctor places a hand on a patient's sternum to feel the resonance beneath the surface. Then he stood back. "Someone tuned this engine wrong," he said. "The fuel mapping on the AMV8 was adjusted, probably during the injector replacement you mentioned, and it's been running about 3% lean in the mid-range since then. It's not dangerous yet, but it'll stress the valve train over time if it's not corrected." Claire stared at him. "How did you determine that without running diagnostics?" Dean looked at her for the first time since she'd arrived. "I ran diagnostics," he said, "just not the kind that needs a screen." Tyler laughed at that, not cruelly, exactly, but with the particular confidence of someone who believes that expertise can only exist in the forms he personally recognizes. "That's impossible without a proper diagnostic system," he said. "You'd need to pull the ECU data to identify fuel mapping irregularities. What you're describing is guesswork dressed up as intuition." Dean didn't look at him. He was already writing something in a small notebook, the kind with a spiral top and water-damaged covers that looked as though it had been riding in a work shirt pocket for several years. "Not if you know Aston engines," Dean said, still without looking up. "You're welcome to stay and watch," he added. which was the conversational equivalent of a door held open with precisely enough courtesy to let someone know that further debate would not be particularly useful. Sadie, who had been watching all of this with the attentive patience of a child, who had grown up absorbing information rather than broadcasting it, leaned over toward Claire and said quietly, "Dad can tell what's wrong before the engine finishes idling. He's been doing it my whole life." Claire looked at the girl, then at Dean, then at the car. She left the keys. That evening, driving back to her office in a rental, she found herself doing something she rarely did, thinking about a person she had just met. Dean worked through the night. This was not unusual for him. The garage had a small cot in the back office that Sadie sometimes slept on when they worked late together, though on nights when the job required full concentration she was home at her grandmother's place 2 miles away. The particulars of Dean Mercer's domestic situation were modest and deliberate. His mother-in-law, a woman named Ruth, kept the house running during school hours and late evenings, and in exchange Dean maintained her car for free and appeared every Sunday morning for breakfast without exception. This arrangement had been in place for 4 years, since Sadie was 5, since the year Paige died. Neither Dean nor Ruth discussed the arrangement in terms of sacrifice or obligation. They simply did it, the way people who understand necessity tend to do things, without ceremony and without complaint, because the alternative was not something either of them was willing to examine. Ruth had once said, on a Sunday morning when the light through the kitchen window was particularly clear and Sadie was outside in the backyard, that Dean had given up more than anyone would ever know to stay close to the things that mattered. He had told her that wasn't how he thought about it. She had said she knew, and that was exactly what she meant. Claire arrived the next morning expecting, at best, a temporary improvement. She had made peace, in the previous weeks, with the possibility that the irregularity in her DB12 was one of those mechanical mysteries that resisted clean resolution, the kind of thing you learn to accept in the way you accept certain bureaucratic inconveniences. With reduced expectations and a vague sense that someone, somewhere, had made a mistake they would never fully acknowledge. What she experienced when she turned the key and pulled out of the Mercer garage forecourt was not a temporary improvement. It was transformation. The engine did not simply run without the irregularity. It ran with a smoothness and a responsiveness that she had never once experienced in the 2 years she had owned the car. A depth of tuning that suggested the machine had previously been performing somewhere below its actual capability, like a voice that had been singing slightly off-pitch for so long that the correction, when it came, felt like revelation. She drove 4 blocks, pulled over, and sat for a moment with her hands still on the wheel. Then she drove another 4 blocks, pulled over again, and sat longer. Naomi Pierce happened to be walking her dog on that same street and recorded about 40 seconds of Claire's face through the windshield, confused, quietly undone, recalibrating something, and posted the clip to her personal page with a caption that read simply, "She went to the garage everyone laughed at." This is what happened. The clip found its way, with the particular velocity that certain pieces of content achieve in specialized communities, into a handful of private groups dedicated to vintage and exotic car ownership. Within 48 hours, people who had never heard of a suburban street in a middle-tier metro area were asking each other variations of the same question: who is Dean Mercer, and how do we find him? The answer, for those who knew where to look, turned out to be complicated. Dean Mercer had not always been the man in the gray work shirt in the 2-bay garage. Before Sadie, before Ruth's house, before the manila folder full of HOA complaints, he had been something that the automotive restoration world used a specific and reverential vocabulary to describe. He had been, for nearly a decade, a factory restoration engineer for a British firm, whose partnership with Aston Martin had made him one of perhaps a dozen people in the world who understood certain engine architectures at the level of their original design intent rather than their service documentation. He had worked on cars that lived in private museums and climate-controlled warehouses. He had flown to 4 continents to evaluate vehicles whose owners communicated exclusively through lawyers, and whose cars arrived and departed by enclosed transport, regardless of distance. He had been, in the particular language of that world, someone you called when everyone else had already told you it couldn't be done. And then, in the year that Paige got sick, and the year that Sadie turned 1, he had quietly resigned, returned home, and opened a garage. Warren Hale arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of unremarkable weekday detail that nonetheless lodges in memory because of what accompanied it. Warren was 71 years old, had made his money in commercial real estate several decades earlier, and had subsequently organized his retirement almost entirely around the acquisition, restoration, and occasional sale of rare British motor cars. He drove a 1967 Aston Martin DB6 Volante that had been in his family since new. His father had bought it in London, his mother had driven it to dinner parties on the Connecticut shore, and Warren had been restoring it, imperfectly but lovingly, for the better part of 15 years without quite being able to bring it to the standard he sensed it was capable of. He had heard about Dean through a network that predated the internet, and operated on the principle that the people who actually knew things were the ones who had stopped trying to be known. When he parked the Volante in front of Mercer Garage and stepped out, he looked at Dean the way someone looks at a person they have heard described over and over, and are relieved to find that the description was accurate. "They told me you were the last real Aston mechanic," Warren said. Dean dried his hands on a shop rag and looked at the DB6. "Who's they?" he asked. Warren smiled. "Everyone worth listening to." Claire had come back that same week, not for her car, which needed nothing, but for reasons she would have had difficulty articulating precisely if asked. She stood at the edge of the forecourt and watched Warren and Dean discuss the Volante with the absorbed fluency of 2 people whose shared language happened to be mechanical rather than spoken, pointing at components and occasionally lying flat on the concrete to look at things from below in the way that people who genuinely love machines will do without any self-consciousness whatsoever. She watched Sadie sketch something in a composition notebook that, upon closer inspection, turned out to be a technically accurate cross-section of the DB6's engine bay, labeled in a careful hand. And she thought about something Dean had said during the repair of her own car. A brief, almost offhand comment that she had not, at the time, known how to place. Some cars, he'd said, stop trusting people after too many bad mechanics. He hadn't elaborated, and she hadn't asked. But standing in the forecourt watching Warren's face as Dean diagnosed the Volante's cooling issue with the same unhurried attention he gave everything, she thought she understood what he meant. The cars remembered, and so did the people who really knew them. Tyler Knox was not taking the situation gracefully. He had lost 2 clients in the space of a single week, both of whom had mentioned, in separate phone calls that he had taken personally, and with effort, that they were trying out that garage on Prentice Street, and the feeling he associated with this development was one he had limited practice managing. He had built Knox Automotive Group on the proposition that luxury service required luxury infrastructure, that the quality of the waiting room correlated meaningfully with the quality of the work, and that anyone operating out of a facility that looked like Mercer Garage was either cutting corners or running on a combination of luck and novelty that would eventually collapse under its own improbability. The idea that the inverse might be true, that the work itself could be so far beyond the facility that the facility became genuinely irrelevant, was not a revision he found comfortable. He began, quietly and through channels he considered private, to ask questions about Dean Mercer's history. The complaint Brooke Calloway submitted that fourth week was longer than her previous 3 combined. The foot traffic issue had escalated, she wrote, in a way that was affecting the quality of life of residents for a 3-block radius. There were cars, beautiful cars, she admitted in a parenthetical that she immediately regretted including, though removing it would have required her to rewrite the paragraph, lining the street on both sides from early morning. There was, on one particular Saturday, an 11-vehicle queue that had temporarily disrupted the normal flow of residential traffic. Her complaint was technically accurate on every point. What it omitted was the quality of the silence that had settled over the street during those hours. The particular hush of a neighborhood that has found itself, without warning, in the presence of something that belongs to a different order of things. Sadie, who noticed these things the way children notice the details adults are too busy to register, had pointed at the line of cars one morning and said to her father, "They used to laugh when nobody came." Dean had looked at the street and nodded slowly. "Some things take time to find their level," he said. The queue that formed on the following Saturday was not 11 vehicles. It was closer to 30. They came from different directions and parked in whatever space was available, creating a spontaneous assemblage that stretched the full length of the block and bent around the corner. A 1971 DB5 in silver birch, a 2004 Vanquish V12, a 2019 DBS Superleggera that had been driven overnight from 3 states away, a DB4 GT that a collector from out of state had transported on an enclosed trailer, refusing to drive it until Dean had reviewed it personally and confirmed it was road-ready, because he had been told that Dean Mercer would know within minutes whether a car was being treated correctly or merely being owned. Naomi Pierce, who had by now developed a habit of positioning herself strategically on weekend mornings with a thermos of coffee and a very good camera, live-streamed the arrival of each vehicle with a running commentary she delivered in the hushed register of someone narrating something they consider historically significant. "The tiny garage," she said, watching another pair of headlights round the corner in the early light, "that collectors secretly trust." The stream ran for 40 minutes. Claire Vaughn stood on the sidewalk across from the garage and felt something she was not immediately able to name. It was not exactly surprise. The events of the previous 2 weeks had already dismantled her original assessment of Dean Mercer so thoroughly that surprise was no longer available to her in the way it had been. It was something more structural than that. It was the particular discomfort of recognizing, in clear and public terms, that a judgment she had made confidently and without much reflection had been wrong in ways that actually mattered. Not just factually wrong, but wrong in its premises, wrong in what it had assumed knowledge could look like, and where it could exist. She crossed the street and stood near the entrance, where Dean was speaking with the owner of the enclosed trailer DB4, and when he finished, she said, simply, "How many people know about you?" Dean looked at the queue for a moment, unhurried, the way he looked at everything. Then he looked back at her. "Enough to keep the lights on," he said. It was Claire herself who pressed Dean, later that week over coffee at the bakery 2 blocks over, to tell her the full story of his time with the British firm. He gave it to her in the compressed, undramatic way he gave most things, not modestly, exactly, but efficiently, with the implication that the emotional texture of events was something she could infer without his assistance. He had been hired out of a postgraduate engineering program by a restoration consultancy that maintained a long-standing arrangement with the manufacturer. He had spent 7 years doing work that he described, without flourish, as genuinely extraordinary, finding solutions to problems that had defeated the official service infrastructure, locating original components through networks that hadn't been formalized in any catalog, rebuilding engines with a fidelity to original specification that most of the industry had long since stopped attempting because the economic case for it rarely existed in ordinary commerce. He had been very good at it. He had also been, he said, the person in the room who raised objections when the firm, under pressure from a corporate restructuring, proposed a series of shortcuts in their restoration protocols that he believed would compromise the safety and integrity of vehicles under high-load conditions. The firm had not welcomed the objections. The restructuring had proceeded. Dean had resigned. He told her this last part without emphasis, the way a person reports weather. "I didn't leave Aston Martin because I failed," he said, with the particular flatness of someone who has reduced a complicated experience to a sentence that is accurate and has decided that further elaboration serves no purpose. "I left because they stopped caring." Claire looked at her coffee for a moment, turning the cup slowly in her hands. She had built her own company from a position that had required her to care, visibly and continuously and sometimes at personal cost, about the quality of what she delivered. It had been the brand proposition from the beginning, the thing that differentiated her consultancy in a market full of competitors who offered similar services at lower prices and higher volume. She understood, in the abstract, what it meant to be the person who raised the objection that wasn't welcome. She also understood, in a way she had not been required to examine until that morning, that she had walked into a garage several weeks earlier and mocked it, and in doing so had mocked the specific integrity that had made its owner build it in the first place. What she did not yet know, and what Tyler Knox had apparently assembled through his inquiries into Dean's history, was that Dean's departure from the firm had been accompanied by a dispute over the attribution of a technique, specifically a proprietary method for restoring original fuel system calibration in early-generation V8 configurations, that Dean had developed independently and documented in detail, and that the firm had subsequently incorporated into their official service protocols without acknowledgement or compensation. The dispute had never been formally resolved. The firm had declined to comment publicly. Dean had moved on without pursuing it, because pursuing it had required a kind of sustained adversarial energy that he had not. In the year that Paige was dying and Sadie was an infant, and Ruth was holding the household together on will and weekly grocery runs, had any capacity to maintain. Tyler had taken the thread to a media outlet that covered the automotive world and pitched it as a story about a mechanic who had been blacklisted from the industry following a professional dispute. The story ran on a Wednesday morning. By Thursday, Dean's phone had received 17 voicemails. The garage was vandalized on Thursday night, a broken side window, a spray-painted message on the rear wall that read 4 words in stenciled red, nothing that rose to the level of serious structural damage but enough to be unmistakable in its intent. Dean replaced the window on Friday morning and painted over the rear wall on Saturday. He did not file a police report, though Naomi Pierce, who had seen the damage during her morning walk, had already photographed and posted about it with enough context that the origin of the story was reasonably clear to anyone who had been following events. The response from the collector community was immediate and sustained. Warren Hale called personally to say, in the measured and precise language of a man who had spent decades operating in environments where words carried legal weight, that anyone who had spent 30 seconds watching Dean work understood exactly what the story had been designed to accomplish, and exactly how much credibility it deserved. He also offered to make a call to someone at the publication whose credibility he considered worth invoking. Dean thanked him and declined. Claire did not decline to act. She had spent 20 years in a profession where your word was either bankable or it wasn't, and she recognized in the story the particular fingerprints of competitive malice dressed as journalism, the selective framing, the absent context, the precision with which the one damaging detail had been extracted from a much longer and more complicated history. She wrote a formal letter to the outlet's editorial board, with specific factual corrections and documentation, and she signed it with her full name and title. She also, in a separate conversation, told Tyler Knox directly, and without the ambiguity she ordinarily reserved for professional disagreements, what she believed he had done. He denied it. She told him she believed the denial was false. The conversation ended there. 3 days later, she received an invitation to the Aston Martin Heritage Expo, and she called Dean that evening and told him he should come. He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Then he said, "Sadie's been asking about it." The Heritage Expo occupied 3 large exhibition halls and a covered outdoor demonstration area where running vehicles could be presented under controlled conditions, their engines heard as well as seen. It drew, annually, a combination of collectors, historians, journalists, brand representatives, and the kind of enthusiast who has organized their entire discretionary existence around a single mark and feels, in these annual gatherings, the rare and specific pleasure of being among people who understand why. Dean and Sadie arrived early, before the main crowds, and spent the first hour moving quietly through the indoor exhibition. Sadie with her composition notebook, Dean with his hands, clasped behind his back in the way he had when he was absorbing something rather than performing. They stopped for a long time in front of a 1964 DBE-5 that had been restored to an extraordinary standard, and Dean spoke quietly to Sadie about 3 specific details of the interior trim that told the story of how the car had been used and where it had been kept in the decades between production and restoration. Sadie wrote everything down. Tyler Knox was there, in a sponsored exhibitor space with a banner and a selection of printed brochures and 2 staff members in branded shirts. He saw Dean from across the hall and did not approach. What happened in the outdoor demonstration area 2 hours later was not complicated in its mechanics. A 1968 DB6 that had been brought in as a centerpiece exhibit, a genuinely rare specification, one of fewer than 50 examples built to a particular factory order for a client in the Gulf region, had refused to start. Its owner had gone through 3 people at the event before someone in the gathering crowd quietly noted that Dean Mercer was on the premises. There was a brief and slightly awkward process of locating him, which ended when a volunteer found him in the indoor hall, explaining the function of the original Weber carburetor setup to Sadie and a small group of bystanders who had gathered with the absorbed attention of people receiving information they hadn't known they needed. He walked out to the demonstration area, crouched beside the open hood, listened for 30 seconds, and then asked for tools. The tools arrived. He worked for 14 minutes, during which the assembled crowd, 40 or 50 people by that point, drawn from the surrounding areas by the particular magnetism of an unexpected situation, was almost entirely silent. Then he stepped back, nodded to the owner, and the DB6 turned over on the first attempt and settled into an idle that was so clean and even and right that several people in the crowd made sounds of involuntary recognition, the sounds people make when something returns to the condition it was always meant to occupy and was being kept from by nothing more than the wrong hands at the wrong moment. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 full seconds. Then a man near the front of the crowd, large, gray-haired, wearing the quietly expensive clothes of someone who has not needed to signal wealth for a very long time, said, in a carrying voice, "We drove across the country for him." He said it to the person standing beside him, but it carried, the way things carry in particular silences, and several people turned toward the speaker, and then back toward Dean with expressions that confirmed, without requiring further elaboration, that this was not an isolated sentiment. That these people had come, from various distances and for their own versions of the same reason, to be in the same space as someone they had heard about and were, now that they had seen him, entirely persuaded by. Tyler Knox, who had positioned himself at the edge of the crowd, stood with an expression that Claire, watching from 15 feet away, would later describe only as the particular face of someone who has invested considerable effort in a thing that has turned out to be exactly as futile as the evidence always suggested it would be. Naomi Pierce raised her camera above the crowd and captured it. The outdoor space of the Heritage Expo, the DB6 running, and through the open gate at the far end of the covered structure, the parking area where attendees had left their vehicles. An unplanned, unrehearsed alignment of machines whose owners had, independently and for their own separate reasons, decided to drive them here on the same day. 30 Aston Martins. Not arranged for the photograph, not organized by any coordinating body, simply present because the people who owned them had heard about Mercer Garage on Prentice Street and had wanted, each for their own variation of the same reason, to exist in the same proximity as the man who had emerged from its open bay. The image that Naomi captured required no caption and no explanation. The rows of machines in the metallic afternoon light receding toward the street, and in the foreground a man in a gray work shirt standing next to his daughter, while the crowd around them slowly and imperfectly reassembled itself around a reality that most of them had not known how to accommodate until that afternoon. Claire Vaughn stood at the edge of the frame and did not move. She had, over the previous month, revised her understanding of Dean Mercer in stages, first in the garage when the car ran, then in the bakery when he told her his history, then in the forecourt watching Warren's DB6, then again each time another unfamiliar vehicle appeared on Prentice Street, and the driver got out holding a piece of paper with an address written on it, and the expression of someone who has been told that a thing is not what it appears, and has driven a considerable distance to confirm this for themselves. But standing at the edge of the Expo's outdoor area with 30 cars in her peripheral vision and the DB6's engine notes still settling in the air, she understood the full scale of what she had dismissed that first morning. She had walked up to a faded sign on a suburban corner and looked at a building and a man and a child, and drawn a conclusion that had felt, at the time, like the kind of efficient judgment that competent people exercise. It had been wrong in its premises, wrong in its evidence, and wrong in what it had decided about the relationship between where a person works and what they are capable of. She didn't speak. There was nothing she could add. Sadie, who had been standing beside her father as the crowd thinned, noticed Claire's expression and tugged once on Dean's sleeve. She pointed, not at Claire but at the parking area, at the row of vehicles and what they meant and what they had always meant, even during the years when the only people who understood it were the ones who had figured it out quietly for themselves. Dean looked at the cars for a long moment. His expression did not change in any way that someone who didn't know him would notice. But Sadie knew, from years of reading, the particular quality of his stillness, the way she read the sound of an engine, with the whole of her attention, and without needing it to be louder than it was, that what he felt at that moment was something quieter and more settled than pride. It was the feeling a person has when the thing they built for reasons that had nothing to do with recognition is recognized anyway, when the work finds its own level, the way he had told her it would. Mercer Garage did not change its address in the months that followed, nor its sign, nor the radio that played classic rock through the cracked window on warm days. Dean accepted new clients carefully on a schedule that accommodated the existing ones without compression or compromise, in the manner of someone who understands that scaling a thing incorrectly is not growth but dissolution. Warren Hale became a fixture, stopping by on Tuesday mornings to drink coffee from the electric kettle in the back office and discuss, at whatever length the morning allowed, the ongoing restoration of the DB6 Volante and the larger question of what it meant to maintain an old machine correctly in a world that had largely decided that old machines were primarily decorative. Naomi Pierce had moved on to other subjects, the way people who document moments professionally must do, but she returned to the garage periodically the way you return to a place where you first witnessed something that later proved to be significant. The garage had become, in a way that none of its neighbors had anticipated, and most of them had not yet fully absorbed, a kind of landmark. Not the official kind, not the kind that appears on maps, but the kind that exists in the geography of a community, because enough people have assigned it meaning. Brooke Calloway submitted no further formal complaints. This was not because the foot traffic had decreased. If anything, it had become more consistent and more varied, the vehicles arriving from greater distances on a schedule that correlated with word having spread through another tier of the collector world. It was because she had, on a Sunday afternoon while washing her car in the driveway, watched a man in a vehicle that was clearly worth more than her house idle, slowly past and park in front of Mercer Garage, and step out holding a folded piece of paper with the address written in ink and the expression of someone who has been looking for a particular place for a long time and is relieved to have found it. She had watched him look at the faded sign with something that was unmistakably gratitude and then walk through the open bay door without hesitation, the way you walk into a place where you know, before you have been there for a single minute, that someone is going to understand what you need. She had not filed a complaint after that Sunday. She had, at the following homeowners association meeting, made a statement acknowledging that her previous assessments of the garage's impact on the neighborhood had been, as she put it carefully, incomplete in their consideration of context. It was not a graceful apology, but it was a genuine one, and Dean, when Sadie reported it to him at dinner that evening, nodded once and returned to the bowl of soup he was eating. Tyler Knox's company did not collapse, because the market for luxury automotive service was large enough to accommodate multiple providers, and because his facilities were genuinely competent at the straightforward end of what they offered. But the story the outlet had run received a formal correction a month after publication. The documentation Claire had submitted, combined with the testimony of two former colleagues of Dean's who had been contacted after Naomi's post circulated, had left the editorial board with no defensible position. Tyler's name appeared in the correction in a subordinate clause that was precise and irreversible. In the specific world where his professional reputation had its highest value, the correction was read carefully and remembered. Sadie, on the first clear Saturday after the Heritage Expo, mounted a new sign on the front wall of Mercer Garage. She had made it herself over 2 evenings on a piece of plywood she had sanded smooth and painted white, in letters she had hand-drawn and then filled in carefully with black paint. Slightly uneven in height but entirely legible and entirely intentional. It read, "Tiny Garage, Big Engines." Dean stood in the forecourt for a long time looking at it. The morning light was good, the kind that comes in sideways and makes the texture of painted wood visible in a way that indoor light never quite achieves. He stood looking at the sign the way he stood listening to an engine, without speaking, with his full attention, giving the thing in front of him the courtesy of being understood before being responded to. Then he went inside and got back to work. The evening that Claire Vaughn remembered most clearly from all of it was not the expo, not the morning she had found her DB12 transformed, not even the afternoon she had stood among 30 Aston Martins in a parking lot and understood what she had nearly failed to see. It was a quiet Tuesday evening in late autumn when she had stopped by the garage after a long day, not for any particular reason, the way you stop by places that have become, without formal announcement or deliberate intention, part of the geography of your daily life. Dean was under the hood of a 1974 DB6, working with the unhurried precision that was his characteristic mode at all hours, and Sadie was at the workbench doing her homework in the particular way she did everything in that space. With one ear always angled toward the car, always receiving the ambient information of the garage, always accumulating without appearing to try. The radio was playing something instrumental. The light was the low, warm gold of a season ending, the kind of light that makes even ordinary things look as though they are being seen for the last time before something changes. Claire stood at the entrance and watched for a moment before Dean looked up and acknowledged her with the small nod he used for people he had admitted, on his own terms and at his own pace, into the category of people whose presence required nothing more than a nod. She looked at the garage, the two bays, the old radio, the tools arranged on their pegboard in the particular order of someone for whom a misplaced tool was not an inconvenience but a small violation of a logic that had been built carefully and maintained deliberately. The milk crate that still sat near the workbench in exactly the position where Sadie had been sitting the first morning. Claire arrived and looked at all of it and drew the conclusion she had drawn. She thought about what she had built over the years. The offices on the 14th floor, the staff in their open-plan workspace, the reputation assembled through 1,000 carefully managed details, the infrastructure of a company whose size had always been partly an argument for its own quality, the implicit claim that a thing must be significant if this many people are involved in it, this much space is devoted to it. She thought about the logic that had made her look at Mercer Garage and find it inadequate. She thought about how much of that logic had been about surface, and how little it had told her about the actual substance of the thing she was looking at. "You could have owned a giant company," she said. The words came out without sharpness, more like an observation released after being held for a long time than a challenge or a provocation. Dean was tightening the final bolt on the valve cover with the small, precise motion of someone who does not over-tighten things and knows, from experience that has become instinct, exactly how much torque is enough and what the consequences are of applying more than that. He held the wrench for a moment after the bolt was seated, the way you hold something when the job is finished correctly and you are allowing yourself a single beat of acknowledgement before moving to whatever comes next. Then he set the wrench down in its place on the tray beside the car, and he looked at her. The light was still good. Sadie had looked up from her notebook and was watching her father the way she always watched him when he was about to say something that she already suspected she knew. "I already built the only thing that mattered," he said. Sadie smiled, the specific smile of a child who has heard something confirmed that she knew was true before it was spoken, the smile of someone who has grown up being shown rather than told and has learned to trust what the showing reveals. Outside, the line of cars caught the last of the light the way they always did on clear evenings. The curves of engineered metal holding the color for a moment before the day released it, each machine a kind of argument for the value of the understanding that had made it right, parked in their patient rows along a street that had once been formally and repeatedly asked to justify the presence among it of a small garage that nobody important had thought was worth their attention. The sign above the door read, "Tiny Garage, Big Engines." The radio played. The last of the autumn light moved across the hood of the DB6 and went, and Dean Mercer picked up his tools and went back to work.
No? Oh, he didn't like that. Oh, wow. Holy shit. Oh, nice. Here we go. Damn. Oh, shoot. Oh, yeah. Oh, no. Oh, my gosh. I fucked up. Oh. I cooked it. It's fucked. I fucked up too many times. What's up, Globally? How you doing? I am from Virginia, bro. I live in California now. How about yourself?